Welcome to the C++ tutorial for template functions. Let's jump straight into it. What a template function actually is, it is a generic data type. That is, it does not follow a particular data type like an integer or a double or a string. It depends on the input actually. So it can basically act as an integer, a float, or whatever the input is. It basically depends on the input. So let's just take an example in which we have to calculate the smaller of two numbers, out of which one is an integer and another one is a float. So we are basically using template functions with two variables. Let's name our class T1 and another class T2. So if we speak in simple words, instead of passing an integer t1 or a float t1 into the function, we are basically passing a t1, instead of passing an integer a or a float a into a function, we would be passing a t1a. Now t1 can be an integer or a float or anything. So let's just quickly design a function. Now what I'll do is that I'll define the function in two ways. One, the function would be of the type t1. Let's call it the function smaller 1. So the variables it will take is a t1a and a t2b. And let's now just define the function. It's going to return if a is less than b, it will return a, otherwise it will return b. So here we have defined a function called smaller 1, which will return an output of type t1. Let's similarly quickly define a function smaller 2 that will return an output of type t2. So again, let's just define two variables, again t1 and t2. Let's define the function return a if a is less than b, otherwise return b. So that's it. It looks pretty good. So and one more thing, if we have to use a template in a function, we again have to define the templates just before the definition of the function. So that's kind of weird, but that is the syntax that is followed by C++. So again we define the same thing that we used earlier again. So let's just quickly build our main function. Now let's define two variables, like integer a that has a value of 100 and double b that has a value of, let's say, 95.5. Okay, so double is basically a decimal function. So now let's just quickly print smaller 1 with variables a and b. Let's end the line, and after that let's just print smaller 2 again with a and b. So let's just compile. As you can see, what happens here is that the first time it is showing 95. Now why that has occurred is because earlier when we were printing out smaller 1, we named smaller 1 as t1. The type of smaller 1 was t1, and when we defined the template, we took t1 first and then we took t2. So whenever an integer a is equal to 100 is passed inside the template, what t1 is an integer. So our smaller 1 function that is the type t1, that is an integer, it gives out 95, and similarly during smaller 2 it gives a float t2. Now that's it. That was the tutorial on the template functions. Thank you. This is Rahil Bansal. Alright, signing off.